Welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to get into something pretty interesting. We're going to look at how religious practices, when you view them through the lens of applied behavior analysis, can actually be seen as pretty powerful examples of behavioral control.
Oh, wow.
So we're going to be using Chapter 23 of Science and Human Behavior as our guide for this.
Okay.
So you're ready to see some familiar religious concepts in a whole new light.
Yeah, it's fascinating how we often separate those two worlds,
Right.
religion and behavioral science, but they really do intersect in some unexpected ways.
It's almost like religion has been using ABA principles for centuries.
Yeah.
Without even knowing it.
Right.
Think about it. Heaven, hell, fasting, rituals,
Yeah.
they all tie back to behavioral concepts.
Absolutely. And the chapter kicks off with this idea that the line between superstition and fact is more of a blurry continuum than a stark division. They use the example of a kid yelling "stop" at a rolling ball,
Right.
even though they know it won't actually do anything.
Yeah, we all do those kinds of things, even as adults, like knocking on wood or wearing your lucky socks for a big game.
Right.
But how does that relate to religion?
Well, think about it this way. Let's say there's a rare event, or even just a coincidence,
Okay.
and it happens to follow a specific action someone took. That person might start to believe that their action caused the event, even if there's no real connection.
So like if someone wins the lottery after carrying a lucky rabbit's foot, they might start thinking the rabbit's foot is actually bringing them good luck.
Exactly. And this is where things can get interesting in a religious context. Imagine a spiritual leader claiming they can influence outcomes, like bringing rain during a drought.
Right.
If by chance it happens to rain after they perform a ritual, people might associate the rain with the ritual and believe the leader actually has special powers.
It's like they're shaping behavior through chance occurrences.
Yep.
And that makes me think of something we often talk about in ABA,
Okay.
reinforcement schedules.
You're right. Specifically, intermittent reinforcement. It's actually one of the most powerful ways to shape behavior. Think about slot machines.
Right.
You don't win every time, but those occasional wins are enough to keep you playing.
So if someone believes that a certain prayer or ritual brought them good luck, even if it was just a coincidence, they're more likely to keep doing it because of that intermittent reinforcement.
Precisely. And this is a key element in how some religious practices exert control over behavior.
That makes perfect sense. It's like the uncertainty of the outcome actually strengthens the belief. Okay, so we've talked about this blurred line between superstition and fact. But how does the book actually define religious control itself?
Well, it boils down to the idea that religious control stems from a claimed connection to the supernatural. This connection is then used to justify the power to influence good or bad luck, rewards, or punishments.
It's like saying, I have a direct line to the ultimate authority, so you better listen to me.
You got it. And within that framework, the chapter outlines different types of religious agencies. Some claim direct intervention. Okay.
Like a medicine man performing a healing ritual. They're basically saying, I can make good things happen for you directly.
So it's like they're acting as the direct reinforcer, like we do in ABA sometimes.
Exactly. Then there are those who claim knowledge of a path to favorable outcomes.
Okay.
Think of a priest explaining how to get to heaven. They're not saying they can directly control the outcome,
Right.
but they claim to know the secret formula.
It's like they're giving you the rule book,
Yeah.
the guide to good behavior.
Right. And then there's the type that functions more like an ethical group, promoting good and discouraging bad. Without necessarily invoking supernatural claims, they focus on establishing norms and values for the group.
So it's like a community reinforcement system where the group itself acts as the reinforcer by praising good behavior and condemning bad behavior.
Exactly. And what's interesting is how these different types of religious agencies parallel the different types of authority we see in ABA therapy.
You have therapists who directly control contingencies, like giving rewards for desired behaviors. Then you have parents who guide behavior by setting rules and expectations. And you have peer groups that exert social influence through acceptance or rejection.
So it's about understanding those different levels and mechanisms of control, whether it's in a religious context or in therapy. That's a really cool connection. But let's get into the nitty-gritty. How do these religious agencies actually exert control over people's behavior? What are the techniques they use?
Well, the chapter highlights the primary technique as classifying behavior as either moral or immoral, and then applying positive or negative reinforcement accordingly.
So basically rewarding good behavior and punishing bad behavior. That sounds pretty straightforward, but what are some of the specific ways they do that in a religious context?
One of the most vivid examples is the concept of heaven and hell. They are presented as the ultimate consequences, powerful and eternal, even though they are delayed.
Ah, the ultimate delayed reinforcers.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't get much more delayed than eternity. But it's interesting how that concept can be so motivating for people.
Right. The promise of eternal bliss or the threat of eternal damnation can be pretty powerful motivators to shape behavior in the present. And it's a great example of how delayed reinforcement can still be incredibly effective.
So it's all about controlling behavior through those ultimate consequences, even if those consequences are way off in the future. It makes you wonder how effective those consequences actually are if they're so far removed from the actual behavior.
That's a great point. And the chapter actually goes on to explore other techniques that might be a little more immediate in their impact.
Okay.
For instance, they talk about manipulation of stimuli.
Right.
Think about things like a cloistered life or censorship, which aim to minimize exposure to temptations.
So it's like environmental control, right?
Right.
Like how in ABA, we might modify a child's environment to remove distractions or temptations.
Exactly. It's about controlling the antecedents to behavior. And then there's satiation and deprivation, which is a fascinating concept.
Okay, tell me more about that one.
Well, the chapter uses examples like fasting or presenting marriage as a deterrent to what they call licentiousness.
So it's like controlling access to certain things like food or sexual activity to influence behavior.
That's it. And it's very much in line with ABA principles.
Uh-huh.
We use similar strategies like token economies, where we control access to reinforcers, or delayed gratification, where we teach people to wait for rewards.
Wow, those are some pretty strong parallels. Yeah. And it makes you realize that a lot of these religious practices, when you look at them from a behavioral perspective, are actually quite sophisticated in their understanding of how to shape and control behavior.
It's true. They may not have called it applied behavior analysis, but they were definitely tapping into some of the same principles.
Yeah, and it's so fascinating to see it laid out like that. So I'm sure there's even more to unpack as we continue this deep dive.
There's another technique that's really interesting, the use of rituals. The chapter talks about how rituals can actually affect your physiology and potentially even change your emotional state.
You mean like how repeating a certain prayer or chant can have a calming effect?
Exactly. Or think about the heightened emotions people experience during a religious service,
Right.
especially with things like music and chanting involved.
Right.
Those physiological changes can actually become reinforcers in themselves.
It's like how we talk about pairing in ABA, right? You can pair a neutral stimulus with something that naturally elicits a response. And eventually the neutral stimulus will start to elicit that response on its own.
That's a great way to put it. And it really highlights how these practices, even though they've been around for centuries, demonstrate a pretty sophisticated understanding of how to shape human behavior.
It's amazing how much we can learn from looking at these ancient traditions through a behavioral lens.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground on the techniques of religious control. But what about the behaviors themselves? What kinds of behaviors do these religious agencies typically target?
Well, the chapter points out that it really depends on the type of religious agency we're talking about.
Yeah.
For one focused on personal gain, like our medicine man example, pious behavior might simply be anything that benefits the leader. But for more established agencies, the focus often shifts to behaviors that align with broader societal values.
So it's like the rules change depending on who's in charge.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
And the book gives some interesting examples of behaviors that go beyond what we might think of as typical ethical control.
Yeah.
It talks about things like gluttony versus temperance, chastity and celibacy versus socially acceptable sexual behavior.
Right. It's not just about preventing harm to others. It's also about controlling personal behaviors and desires. The chapter also talks about poverty versus material acquisition, humility versus boastfulness, and even pacifism and self-sacrifice versus self-preservation.
Wow, that's a pretty wide range of behaviors. But it makes sense when you think about how these behaviors, while often framed in moral terms, can also be understood through the lens of behavioral science.
Absolutely. For example, promoting temperance or humility could be seen as shaping behaviors that reduce conflict and promote social harmony within a group.
So even though these behaviors might seem counterintuitive from a purely individualistic perspective, they can actually serve a purpose in maintaining the cohesion and stability of the group as a whole. That's fascinating.
It is, and the chapter even mentions how religious agencies often work to establish what they call a repertoire of obedience for future use.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
Essentially, they're shaping a pattern of compliance that extends beyond the immediate presence of the religious authority. It's like building a habit of following the rules even when no one is watching. And that ties back to the internal mechanisms we were talking about earlier, like prayer and meditation.
You got it. Those practices can be seen as ways to strengthen self-control by either reinforcing desired behaviors or punishing undesired ones.
It's like internalizing the rules and consequences so you become your own enforcer.
Exactly. And the chapter points out that this emphasis on punishment,
Uh-huh.
both external and internal, can lead to a very strong conscience, or what we might call a superego in
Right.
psychology,
Okay.
which can sometimes be even more stringent than societal norms.
It's like setting the bar for good behavior even higher than what society expects. But, this whole discussion makes you realize that no system of control, religious or otherwise, is absolute.
That's true.
People push back, they resist, they find ways to exert their own agency.
That's a really important point. And the chapter does acknowledge that it mentions conflicts with other agencies.
Right. Individual resistance and historical examples of counter-control measures.
Yeah.
Throughout history, we've seen movements challenging religious authority,
Right.
questioning dogma, and demanding reforms.
So it's like a constant tug of war between control and counter-control, between the forces that seek to shape behavior and the individuals who strive to maintain their autonomy.
Exactly. And that brings us to another crucial point, the limitations of behavioral analysis in fully explaining religious beliefs and practices.
Oh.
While ABA can offer valuable insights into the mechanisms at play, it doesn't address the theological or philosophical underpinnings of those practices.
Right, so we can analyze the how, but the why often lies in a different realm.
Precisely. Whether a specific practice is justified based on faith, tradition, or some other framework is a question that goes beyond the scope of behavioral science.
It's about recognizing the boundaries of what our field can and cannot explain.
Exactly. And I think it's important to be mindful of that as we explore these complex topics.
As we've been talking about these different types of religious agencies and how they exert control, it's made me think about something the chapter touches on briefly. The idea of explaining the agency itself.
Oh, that's an interesting point. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the chapter suggests that if a religious agency's main function is to extend ethical control and serve the group,
Uh-huh.
then its existence might be explained by the support it receives from the group.
Okay.
Basically, the group reinforces the agency for promoting behaviors that benefit the collective as a whole.
That makes a lot of sense from a behavioral perspective. If the agency's actions are seen as contributing to the group's well-being, the group is more likely to support and sustain it.
Yeah.
It's a mutually reinforcing relationship.
Exactly. And then the text goes on to present an alternative interpretation specifically for those religious agents who seem particularly zealous in their efforts to avoid temptation.
Ah, yes. I remember that part. It suggests that these individuals might be driven by a strong personal need to suppress their own impulses. And their involvement in the agency serves as a form of self-reinforcement.
It's like they're using the agency's structure and rules as a way to manage their own internal struggles.
That's a really insightful observation. And it highlights the complex interplay of personal motivations and social dynamics within these systems of control. It suggests that the line between controlling others and controlling oneself can sometimes be quite blurry.
It's a reminder that even within systems that promote conformity, there's always room for individual variation and unique motivations.
Absolutely. And understanding those individual motivations can give us a much richer and more nuanced understanding of how these systems operate.
Yeah, it really is fascinating to kind of dig into this and look at all these different angles.
Absolutely.
It's amazing how we can find these connections between seemingly unrelated topics, like religion and behavioral science. We've covered so much ground today, but it feels like we've just scratched the surface.
It really shows how much insight we can gain by applying a behavioral lens to even the most complex aspects of human experience.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from all of this?
I think the most important takeaway is that looking at religion through the lens of ABA doesn't diminish its significance or complexity. It simply offers us a new tool for understanding how behavior is shaped and how people navigate those big questions of self-control, social expectations, and finding meaning.
It's not about replacing one way of looking at it with another. It's about adding another layer of understanding.
Right. It expands our toolbox for making sense of the world around us.
And to leave you with something to ponder, how do these insights on religious control make you think differently about other areas of influence in your life, your family, work, even the media you consume? Are there subtle ways behavioral principles are shaping your thoughts and actions?
It's a question worth exploring. We encourage you to reflect on these ideas and see where they lead you. Until next time, keep diving deep.